Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the TRE podcast. I'm your host, Matt Salesio, joined by an exceptional guest today, Zack Langlois. Zack, thanks for being here, man.
I'm super grateful. You know, I was reflecting on the fact that you and I met in the most random parking lot downtown Toronto at the most random fitness fair event thing. It was an indescribable morning, and I'm not even really sure why we were there in the first place. But it was just one of those things. And out of that, a relationship with you might have been the most productive part of that. But it's crazy. Fast forward now that we're sitting down together, and I'm grateful for you, man. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, well, I love that you brought that up, the expo in Toronto, because I was also thinking about that the other day. And there's like maybe 10, 15 vendors there, but there was only one I actually connected with, and that was you. And I'm thinking about that was 2022-ish?
Yeah.
Long time ago. And then we connected again via Instagram. You're like, yeah, where are you at? Where are you at? Let's get into the studio. And you're like, I actually live 10 minutes from you. Like, oh, that's even more aligned. So the fact that we're sitting here today, the universe has got divine timing, and I'm excited to get into the episode today.
It's perfect, man.
So before I jump in, I always like to ask my guests one special question before we get into the nitty gritty. Do you have an intention for today's episode? What do you hope our listeners take away, or just even be open-minded to today?
It's a great question. I think if there's an intention for today, it would be to create that conscious connection that we were talking about a little bit off podcast, and for listeners to tune into what I believe the highest calling is for any individual, which is to know ourselves and to experience ourselves in a new way, and to experience the fact that we are all incredible human beings with incredible capability, and each one of us deserves to thrive from a physical, mental, spiritual, emotional standpoint. And so if we are able to use conscious connection to achieve that goal, and we can do that a little bit today in terms of sharing some information in the discussion, I think that would be beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that you said the conscious connection to start out, because it even goes back to what we just spoke about with your call the other day when somebody was calling you a food company. And I think this is a great starting point to get into what you mean by conscious connection, and especially where it relates to food. So can you just break down how Northern Raised, which is your company, is not just a food company, but rather the why behind it and how it relates to the intention around this conscious connection with what we eat?
Yeah. So I think at the heart of it, Northern Raised is a company that is built to connect people with their personal well-being through the food on their plate. Right? That is the inherent mission that lives behind the physical reality of being a food delivery company. And we were joking a little bit about that in the context of, people seeing how you show up and thinking one thing, but understanding that there's, really a heart and an energetic sort of driving force behind what it is that we're creating. And so, I really believe, and through my own health journey, uncovered that food is an incredibly powerful tool. And it can be a healing force. It was the thing that helped me in my healing journey, in my health journey. I believe that food can transform lives, and having a conscious connection to that food is a starting point that so many of us miss, and really is disincentivized in our current food environment, in our current health environment. We exist in a broken system that I'm sure we'll dive into, right? That would much rather have us disconnected from ourselves, from what we consume, from the world around us, right? A system that thrives off of that disconnection and profits off of that disconnection from self. And my hope is that, Northern Raised, Revive, companies and businesses like what you and I are creating are the vehicles to bring back the conscious connection, to restore that ability for people to connect in a meaningful way to the food on their plate, to themselves, and to the world around them.
Beautifully said. And I think it's really great the fact that, number one, I'm a vegan, and number two, your company sells lots and lots of meat. So in this conversation today, we're either going to, number one, finish with a fist fight, or number two, we're going to talk about the areas of overlap in both of our eating philosophies, and how restoring this conscious connection, this really natural connection to our food, can make such a world of a difference. Because I think that's where a lot of our philosophies around eating overlap. So I really want to dive into where we both resonate with and agree on, so we don't leave listeners more polarized and disconnected and confused. Rather, they can go away from this conversation saying, okay, here's some overarching things that I need to bring into my diet and my way of life. and they feel more in a place of abundance rather than fear around food, because there's a lot of fear, disconnection around food. But where I want to touch on, basically what you just said, was this disconnection tool that big companies that have really just thrived off of for the last little bit. So for listeners who don't really understand what you mean by companies disconnecting us from our food, just lay the land for us here, pun intended. But yeah, lay the land for us.
Yeah, great segue here. So I think it's helpful to maybe understand the state that we find ourselves in is one of incredible dis-ease or disease, right? And so if we kind of look at this empirically, right, and understand where the state of health is today here in Canada, we look at a population that has close to 50% of our population living with chronic disease, right? And those diseases stem from diet-correlated issues such as heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and so on and so forth, right? And so when we think about the fact that close to 50% of our population lives with some sort of state of chronic disease, we start to ask the question of like, why, how have we found ourselves in this position? Without, going into a lengthy history lesson here, we can see the rise of ultra-processed food and correlate that directly to the rise in diseased states for individuals. And when we start to make that connection, we start to understand where the disconnection stems from, right? So when we think about, we'll take ultra-processed food, for example. We came from a place where we had an over generation of food. We were feeding soldiers through wartime eras that incentivized governments to subsidize a plethora of food production. But we, moved through that time period in history, and we found ourselves on the other side of that, not necessarily needing all of the food that we had produced. The problem being that we still had a system that was heavily subsidized, and we needed to do something with the byproducts of that food. One of the biggest, I think, kingpins in this was corn production. And so the byproduct of corn production became modified cornstarch and a lot of the ethanol-based products that we have now in ultra-processed food. And so when you follow, again, not to get too granular in the history lesson, but when you follow this path of the rise in ultra-processed food, correlate that to the disease state that we're in, and see the profit that lives in the middle of that, and how large food companies would much rather have us highly marketed to for ultra palatable food that has very, very low nutritional value and leaves us feeling a little bit sick, a little bit hungry, wanting a little bit more of the next thing. And now we have this consumption hamster wheel that has been turned on, where I am constantly going back for more and more and more of this ultra processed food that, leaves me feeling, sick and disconnected. I think that is sort of the backdrop and the lay of the land as to where we stand today, and how we've kind of outsourced the need to connect with our food and really the ability to connect with our food. And it's by design, because this system has brought us to this place.
Mm-hmm. And here's the other thing I want to just tack on there too, is the fact that these companies and the food that they're marketing towards us, marketing is one of the key components of that disconnection tool. Because if you look at even the early onsets of tobacco and the way that they were marketing it, when you look at big food, they're taking exact replica play-by-plays from their playbook and using it for food, which also has an addictive nature, again, fueling that hamster wheel that you were just speaking about. And even look at the way when we're saying connect with our food. You and I are advocates for whole foods, natural, like from the earth food. How often do you see commercials for broccoli or for, just regular chicken? Maybe there is some for chicken, I won't lie. Maybe it's commercially raised or this and that. But there's very few instances where there's a lot of marketing and gimmicks for real foods. And when you look at all the other different things that come along with the processed foods, so like chips, the candies, the sodas, those are even influenced by athletes, by people that are authorities within the industry. So we're just further disconnecting ourselves because we're, again, outsourcing our, what's the word I want to say here? Choices to the big companies that are saying, you want this. This is what you want. And because it's continual, we just say, yeah, sure. And we don't consciously think about what we're going to put into our body. We just go with what we've seen on the TV. There it is in the supermarket. How do I put that in my cart? Just like that.
Yeah. We're told that we are too busy that our lives are too busy to care or to have time to invest in boiling broccoli, versus just turning to a bagged meal or a, microwave dinner, right? Or fast food, Uber Eats, you name it, right? That is the marketing ploy that has said food is too complex, it is too unattainable, it's too much work. Don't worry about that, Matt and Zach, right? Don't worry about that. We will provide a convenience heavy alternative that will, at a biological level, like, shift into the biology for a second, at a biological level will spark essentially a dopamine response to a sugar dump that will make you feel like you have achieved the goal of satiating your body, where in fact it's a Band-Aid solution, right? But the marketing that lives in there starts with this disconnection, this powerful disconnection tool that says, no, don't worry about turning to the produce aisle, right? You don't, that's a scary part of the grocery store. We're going to make this really easy for you, right? We're going to categorize aisle after aisle after aisle of grocery store products, ultra processed food that seems to has the appearance of coming at a low cost, right? We can talk about the real cost and the real impact of that, right? But it is low cost, ultra palatable food made really, really easy for you.
It's almost too accessible, right? It's like as easy as turning on Netflix, just push of a button. Where you walk into the grocery store, where's the first place you go?
Yeah.
Right down the aisles. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's quickly dive into maybe a little bit of your personal story around this, because I know you say you heal yourself through food, and a lot of that probably came from connecting back to what you were eating. So can you even just paint a picture, like what was Zack like before he went down this path and to where you are now, and how you feel on both sides of the spectrum?
So before going down this path, I was probably about 30, 40 pounds heavier than I am today.
Wow.
I was riddled with mental health, anxiety, challenges that within my own, not only physical body, but, emotional and spiritual body, I was struggling, I was at a low point. And it was an interesting time of life for me going back, about 10 years when, I began into a career and spent, over a decade in a career that really incentivized me to live a life that I thought at the time served me, right? And it was very much a corporate culture of heavy, heavy travel, a bit of a party life and happy hour after work and, all of these things. And it was interesting, because I found myself objectively successful in that world and climbed the corporate ladder to a high degree. And but when I got to the end of that road, I found myself in a serious state of disease, right? Where my mental health was suffering, my physical body. And so I really had to think differently about how I was going to live the next chapter and heal myself. And I turned to our conventional medical system, and quite honestly, man, was just met with a Band-Aid solution of, hey, you're feeling stressed? Well, take this pill and call us later, right? And there were some really heavy moments, man. Moments I remember sitting in my car, just, tears streaming down my face, thinking like, this is not it, right? This is not my path to health. These Band-Aid solutions of what I was being offered. And so I really took it upon myself to say, okay, how can I heal myself and turn to things like food and movement and, mindfulness, recovery, things now that you and I would probably agree are like the obvious, but at that moment, right, those were like mountains for me to climb, right, to turn down the 5 o'clock happy hour and the 3 to 4 beers and the travel schedule that took me, out of my own bed for, weeks at a time. And right, that life, I had to go through the process of redesigning, which ultimately led to me healing myself. And, I'm grateful that it brought me to the creation of Northern Raised, and certainly, a path of connecting with local farmers, and really understanding where my food came from, seeking out the highest quality food that I could, source for myself and for my family. Right, like those were the sort of the steps, along the path that brought me here. But it really started from a real low moment of not being in a place of thriving whatsoever, and having to heal myself.
Wow, powerful, man. Thank you for sharing. I know that was a little personal, but again, a lot of people could probably resonate with that, right? So even getting along that path of yours and into where you are now with Northern Raised, I want to talk about how you've built this crazy awesome community of farmers within your ecosystem and how it differentiates from the regular meat industry and the conventionality that comes along with a lot of the commercially raised and the socially acceptable ways that we consume food. Because a lot of those two different sources of meat can mean very different things for your health, for your well-being, and honestly, how you feel. So break down like how you guys differentiate. And I know you have a lot of knowledge around what kind of goes wrong with the current industry as we're seeing it play out.
Yeah. So we base our sourcing practices on 4 kind of key tenets. And we think about food in 4 buckets: natural, sustainable, ethical, and local. And we ask ourselves questions based on, each one of those factors. So is this food natural? Is this food sustainable, ethical, and local? And so we could go through a bit of a detailed breakdown on those, but to summarize that quickly, right? Natural food. Are we dealing with animals that are raised in a species-specific environment, fed a species-specific diet, right? That's something that we've come far and away from, especially with, conventional farming production, right? You have the majority of cattle production being corn finished, grain finished, moved to feedlot environments. That is not a natural environment for that animal. They're not raised in a species specific environment, for their entire lives. So, impact there. The same with poultry, the same with pork, right? The second would be, asking a question about, is it sustainable? And this is certainly a large and a deep rabbit hole to go down, right? But we think about this, especially with the small scale farmers that we work with. Are we thinking about the production of meat in a manner that abides by regenerative principles, right? Thinking about a farm or an ecosystem being this system made up of systems, and that each animal that is farmed within that system has a role to play in the environment in which it lives, right? And so, an example of this would be sort of the ruminant life cycle, or the life cycle of a ruminant animal, being that, a cow, for example, will enter a pasture, trot up the earth, eat, poop, repeat, right? That creates an opportunity for soil to sequester carbon back into the soil. It churns nutrients, contributes to soil health. You can then backfill that with chicken grazing, right? So you can move pasture chicken grazing into that system, and they'll come and, peck away at all the cow shit that's been dropped. And essentially we've created, this small regenerative loop, right? That can be recycled over and over again and contribute to the health of an ecosystem, right? Yeah. So that's one way to think about the sustainability. And there are many others. Obviously, the ethical component is another deep rabbit hole, and pulls on a lot of different kind of moral fibers, I guess, in terms of an individual's willingness to consume animal products. My view on this would be that we need to make sure that animals are treated and seen as sentient beings that have a life that is taken to fuel ours. And so we need to approach that process with gratitude, with connection, with responsible consumption, and ensure that we are doing everything in our power to care for the quality of that animal, as it's being raised. And then finally, the locality of food, right? This plays a little bit into the sustainability as well, just in terms of reducing our food miles, and obviously the carbon impact of transportation of food and production of food. But thinking about food on a hyper locality scale, right? We do a lot of tracking and metrics as to understanding the food miles and the impact that your food is having before it reaches your plate. And so we think a lot about where we are sourcing our food from, and try to keep that local to the populations that we serve, and providing the transparency so that you as a consumer can understand exactly where your food came from, where did it travel, where was it produced before it got to your plate.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And those 4 pillars, if I'm looking at an overarching principle for it, it literally relates back to conscious awareness. You understand exactly what choices you're making, where, like you said, where your food's coming from, and all the other behind the scenes that we normally never see within the food system. And I think that's really great, especially I want to put a pin in that natural one that you said, making sure that we understand our food isn't grain finished or soy finished, whatever it is, because that's a very unnatural ecosystem that you're putting an animal in. And from my personal knowledge, I know that a lot of the corn and soy that is fed to conventional animal or livestock, it's laced with a lot of inflammatory chemicals and things that spike that within animals. So then when you go ahead and eat that, you're essentially eating all those same inflammatory markers, all those antibiotic residues. Sometimes they even feed cows candy, like at some points, you know what I mean? So understanding that, hey, my food is not natural, even though it looks like it's natural because it's a steak, whatever it is. There's a lot more behind the scenes that I think a lot of us really need to be aware of, because that is not what is going to fuel our body in a healthy way, right? Your animals are coming from a place where there is none of that residue. There is none of that inflammatory markers that is going to contribute to our health or negatively. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So let's talk about that natural point, and especially let's turn it on the vegan lens now. This is something we were speaking about earlier too. A lot of people say that vegan is not the way to go and they don't feel good on the diet, or they try it out and I lost so much weight, I'm tired, I'm lethargic. And this could probably stem from the fact that when we think vegan, we mostly think salad, pasta, and a lot of other snacks that considered to be vegan. But that's where this, again, disconnect comes from, because you're not understanding what this whole philosophy of veganism can mean. Whole foods, complex carbohydrates, lots of good protein sources that come from real sources. So break down what you think as well, especially on that topic of ultra-processed foods, and how people think that's vegan and that's maybe not the route they should go because they didn't try it right.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote that says that it is no semblance of health to be adjusted to a maladjusted world. And so in this context, I take that quote to apply that to the idea of veganism, to say, if we are going to choose a route to not consume animals, we have to do it in as responsible a manner as if we were consuming animals. And to simply say that we've adjusted our diet to meet a label, but in the background, the majority of our diet consists of ultra-processed foods, and we're consuming a whole bunch of, essentially junk. Mm-hmm. We can't use that as as the backdrop to filling the quota to say, well, I'm vegan and therefore I have some sort of superiority to my diet, or that I'm doing it well. I think we talked a little bit earlier about the need to have conscious awareness of how something serves you, right? And so if you're somebody that has chosen to eat primarily a plant-based diet, beautiful. Bring conscious awareness to that. Be critical about how you're fueling your body. Be very intentional about how you're fueling your body. I don't think that the dietary choices that we make, that we can simply just, say, well, I'm plant-based, so therefore I'm healthy, right? I think that's maybe what the world has taught us to believe. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's this whole wave or rise right now in like carnivorism. Just because I'm carnivore means that I've got a six-pack and I can bench 300 pounds and, and I'm the ultimate man, right? That's also a fallacy. And so I think really what I always advocate for is nuance and that conscious level of consumption, right? When you go to consuming a plant-based diet, are you doing it in a way that fully fuels you and helps you thrive, right? And are you being conscious within yourself outside of, societal pressures or labels or other, parts of that discussion, right? Are you turning the lens inward and saying, hey, this really serves me? And if it does, amazing, right? Now let's get into the granularity of like how you're really going to optimize a plant-based diet to serve your life, right? But to grab that, label of veganism or vegetarianism, and then turn to ultra processed food to backdrop it,
missing the mark.
Is missing the mark. Yeah.
Everything that you say I resonate with, and I want to tack on another point here, and the fact that when you're asking if this food serves me, is food is information. Your food and your body is going to tell you how that food is going to make you feel. But because we live in such a disconnected world, a fast-paced world, we put Band-Aids on those bullet holes. I'll give you the perfect example. This is one that I always used to struggle with. I would always get massive heartburn after usually dinner. And I wouldn't think anything of it. I just pop, I can't say brand names, but you would pop something that would ease the acidity that's coming up from there. And after that, you just go on about your day, forget it ever happened, and then repeat tomorrow, just take another one and keep going. I was ignoring that feedback that was coming from the food that is clearly not serving my body, because heartburn, it burns like a son of a gun. And then again, it gets into this notion that it's ruining my sleep. It's keeping me up. It's not able or allowing me to sleep well. Now I'm going to show up to work tired. I'm going to show up a little bit cranky. And then this whole spiral continues. But it would have stopped, providing I would have just taken a moment and said, what is causing this heartburn? How can I stop that? I've actually found out that it's tomatoes. Tomatoes are super acidic, and I'm Italian, so we have pasta all the time. So yeah, it's going to give me some heartburn. So I've actually taken in that feedback that my body was giving me. I tuned the heck in and said, let me go ahead and optimize this diet in a way that's going to make me feel the best. So I think even just understanding that feedback loop with what your body is telling you is going to monumentally shift how you're going to feel, regardless whether you're plant-based, carnivore, paleo, whatever the heck it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great point. That is the epitome of conscious connection to yourself, right? You've set a framework for yourself in the lens of veganism, right? And you've said, okay, here's some general guardrails around how I'm going to structure my diet, if we're going to use that word, four-letter word, right? Diet. But here's some general guardrails around how I'm going to structure this. Now let's bring some hyper awareness to the moments where I don't feel fully optimized within the framework that I've chosen, right? So there is no judgment against choosing a vegan framework. Now let's work within that framework to understand how to make Matt thrive or how to make Zach thrive, right? And to bring awareness to the fact that tomatoes, they cause some heartburn, right? Maybe nightshade vegetables aren't my thing. Maybe I've got a bit of a reaction there. Maybe I need to look for alternatives, right? I think that is the basis of creating conscious connection, and then to do so within a dietary framework is completely acceptable, and I think really helpful for people to we got busy lives. It's nice to kind of have a general understanding of how I approach or have a strategy to how you approach food. I think it keeps some healthy controls on it, and then we get granular as to how we're going to optimize. Huge. And this jogs my mind to the next point I really wanted to talk about, especially on that awareness piece. We live in a very fast-paced world. How many times are you guilty of eating in front of the screen? Just be honest. How many times? Lots, right? Lots, right? Yeah. I was watching a clip from the Rich Roll podcast the other day, and they were talking about mindful eating. And usually as somebody, especially as a guy, you're like, mindful eating, what is that? Get it out of the way. But it really made me think about how many times I actually sat down with a meal and just ate the meal. You're looking at the flavors, like how does it taste? Is it hot? Is it cold? Did I prep the meal in a hurry? Did I prep the meal with all the vegetables or all the seasonings or all the things that I needed to put in there to make this nice, cohesive, full dish? And it really got me thinking, it's like, not really. I don't do that all the time. And just to bring awareness to what you're eating in a mindful way, I feel like eating that food in a calm, centered way, that food is going to operate much differently in your body than if you were to eat that in a much more stressed, fast, rush pace. What's your take on that? So the example or the analogy that I'll pull is my own lived experience of the concept of prayer. So I grew up in a household where we prayed before meals. And as a kid, quite honestly, I didn't get it, right? Like to me, it was a very disconnected thing, kind of, big man in the sky. I don't know. Let's just get on with the meal, right?
Burgers,
that's it. Hurry up, Dad, right? But as I've kind of gained in my awareness of this, the concept of prayer, and use whatever language you want, if prayer is not your thing, but a moment of reflection or pause or meditation or awareness prior to eating a meal, forget the woo-woo part for a second, the spirituality part of it for a second. That is simply, when you talk about food being information, we are biologically informing our body to enter into a rest and digest state, right? We are creating an environment that allows the nutrients to be absorbed, allows our body to digest, allows our body to take time to absorb and then, produce the energy of the food that it is that we're consuming. Take that a step deeper into a level of, spiritual or conscious connection, and it's a moment of gratitude, right? It's thinking through the life force that is the food on our plates and rolling that out into how it is going to serve us once that meal has been consumed, right? grateful for how that meal was produced and how it was brought to our plates, and maybe grateful for the people that we're sharing it with. This is something that throughout human history, we have used food as a powerful connection tool. And in this disconnected era, right, that's, separated by screens and social media and fast-paced, fast food environment, we've lost that ability to sit down as a family unit, as friends around a table and break bread together, right? This is something that, for all of human history has been this, this amazing trust building human connection tool. And it's interesting, they correlate this now to studies where they look at the rise the correlation, between the rise of childhood obesity and family or meals shared as a family. And in households where meals are shared as a family and there's a family dinner time, you have a inverse effect to childhood obesity. Whereas, kids that grow up in homes where you don't sit down and have a meal together, there tends to be a rise in childhood obesity.
Wow.
So you think about, and it makes a lot of sense. If we just throw, whatever meal of the day, don't have time to make it, throw it out on the counter, or leave kids up to their own devices to snack away on whatever junk food we, pulled out of the grocery store that week, it's not a stretch to understand the concept. But I love the idea that you're talking about in terms of slowing down the process, right? And whether that's through a mechanism like prayer or a simple reflection or a simple pause at the beginning of a meal to inform the body that it is ready to rest, digest, and receive, all the amazing nutrients.
Huge. And I think even the other point that I want to make for me is what I found is making space to cook. Like, if you're going to prep a meal or you're going to make a meal, give yourself the space to make that. Don't rush it, because I find for me, when I'm making a meal and I'm rushing, I'm not going to chop that. Oh, I don't need that. I'll use the white refined grains because it cooks faster, whatever it is. Making the space to cook it, however, though, I'm going to make better choices and have a much more diversity in that meal because I've now allowed all the other things to just manifest properly. I'm going to actually take the time to make a meal that's going to nourish my body, and I'll make better decisions. So even making the space to cook a meal can be monumental, huge, right?
Love that.
So let's dive into it's a touchy topic. So let's dive into the ethical parts of what we're talking about with animals, and especially how it relates to the commercially raised and the livestock that goes along with what we're seeing in the food system right now. So can you even just shine some light on where your perspective is, especially with Northern Raised, how you're combating some of the things that go on within the conventional meat industry?
100%. So the current food system is broken. That's an area you and I fully agree on, right? And the way that livestock is produced in call it a commercialized or industrialized system, is 100% broken. And we've all seen the horror story kind of clips of how animals are treated in some of these environments. And that is categorically not the way that we should be raising livestock. What I uncovered with Northern Raised is this ecosystem of people, humans, that care really, really deeply about the animals that they raise. And they are heavily, heavily invested in the well-being of these animals because it produces incredible quality food. And so it should. If we take care of an animal throughout its life and keep it in a low-stress environment, in that species-specific environment, and feeding it good quality, food throughout its life, it's going to produce an incredible quality of meat at the end of its life. And so, Northern Raised is really advocating through partnering with, small scale farmers. We're advocating for that care of animals. One of our major suppliers, they are an SPCA approved farm, one of the few in Canada. And so their standard of animal welfare is second to none, right? And the individuals that care for the animals, put an incredible amount of work into that. I think the challenging part is that the end of life is an inevitable part of that process. And that's where we can get into, I think some of the challenging moral convictions around what it is to consume animals. I can speak only personally that, in uncovering and understanding and gaining more transparency and connection to where my food has come from has helped me build a better relationship with knowing that if I'm going to consume an animal, I'm going to do it from the highest quality source available. I'm going to ensure that that animal was cared for throughout its entire life. When I consume it on my plate, I'm going to have gratitude for that life. I'm going to make sure that we consume it in a sustainable manner, being a nose to tail consumption, that nothing gets wasted. You know, if I have a chicken for dinner, the carcass of that chicken is going into soup, right? And I'm going to process that through. I eat beef organs, right? I eat nose to tail on an animal to make sure that we're consuming every part of that animal, right? And so to make sure that we're using the extent of that life, right? And so that's just, you know, those are some of the ways that I think I've kind of, you know, come to understand the ethical side of things. And I don't want to be judgmental in an individual's choice to think differently about that. I believe that if you've had an opportunity to, you know, have a conscious thought about, you know, the food that you're consuming, and it takes you on a path where, you know, you don't believe that animal consumption is for you, beautiful, right? But I do think that there is a way to do it better than maybe what the conventional or the industrial system is producing. And I think that's a real misnomer of, you know, all meat is, somehow awfully treating animals. It's just not true.
Yeah, well, I admire that a lot about what you do with Northern Raised, because I know you say, even on your website, it's all over there, we uphold rigorous standards for a lot of the suppliers that we have. So number one, that's already doing so much for the end consumer, because now they're knowing that the people that they are buying from are vetted and the animals are going to be treated well. Looking back to when I was prior to being vegan, I think one of the biggest things that disconnected me was not knowing what went on behind the conventionality behind regular raised livestock. I was that guy who was always like, vegans, what are you guys saying? Like, animals, you just got to eat them. Bacon, I could never live without. Like, just so ill-informed that I didn't even know the weight that was, what my words were carrying. But then over time, obviously, as I went throughout my journey with veganism, I watched this documentary called Earthlings. Have you ever seen it?
I haven't, no.
So it is a very shocking documentary. I wouldn't recommend watching it if you're somebody with either a weak stomach or very emotional, because it really shows you what goes on behind the scenes with conventional raised animals. Like, honestly, Zach, when I watched it, I was vegan for like 4 years at this point. I cried. Like, I dead ass cried. I came downstairs and my family was like, "What's wrong with you guys?" Anyways, it was a whole thing. But knowing where your food is coming from and actually giving yourself the insight into that and allowing yourself to not just be dismissive towards where your food's coming from, I think is the first step to either one, maybe adopting a plant-based diet, or two, choosing from farms that are actually going to treat animals with a sense of dignity. And again, that just comes at a place where you need to inform yourself. So I think that's huge in terms of the ethical realm. Inform yourself before you start throwing slander around. You know what I'm saying?
I'll throw this out too as a question to you, and you know, get your sort of thought on it. Like, I think about the misnomer that a vegan diet is a deathless diet. And I don't believe that to be true. I believe that, and again, this comes back to, I think, how some folks that consume a vegan diet often turn to a world of ultra processed food and don't have the transparency, the understanding to realize that when your ultra processed vegan snack is brought to the grocery store, it comes at the price tag of a whole destruction of an ecosystem that includes the loss of life at a much wilder rate than it is to kill a single animal, like a single cow, for example. And I don't know how that lands for you, just in terms of kind of thinking about that through chain of what it is to truly produce food and to know that, or, you know, how that impacts. But yeah, what's your take there?
Yeah, it is a touchy topic, and it's not the first time I've heard that too. Like, even when they just talk about making avocados, like the amount of even insects, if you want to get into like what source of life, all that's got to go. So I think one of the biggest takeaways here is the plant-based diet is not perfect, the same way that an animal-based diet is not perfect. At the end of the day, as consumers, we can make the best choice we can to, like you said, shop local, shop at a place where you more or less know where your food's coming from, rather than these big conglomerates that are disrupting the supply chain of food. But I think there's lots of areas for improvement in both. In both. I'm not going to be here and say, hey, the vegan diet is the best diet because it's a deathless diet. I know that's not the case. So I'm not going to be here with my back against the wall, throwing all things back at you. There needs to be improvement across both. But one thing that was shocking to me when I was having this conversation a couple while back, they were talking about a lot of the plant-based foods that are getting produced and how disruptive it is towards land use, fresh water use, and all the other things that go into the environmental degradation of it. When you looked at a lot of the different plant foods that were being utilized was for the conventional raised livestock. So as an example for soy, this one's coming to the top of head, only 7% of soy that is across all this different land, across all this different degradation is being used for humans, only 7%. Meanwhile, 77% or whatever it was is being used to farm conventionally raised livestock. So I think even on that topic is where we're pointing the finger, we got to make sure where we're pointing that finger. Again, I'm not too versed in where each crop is getting utilized for human consumption or animal consumption, but just understanding there's a lot more behind the scenes that we don't know. But just do your best to shop local, shop with transparency, and support people that are actually doing a difference with their business.
Yeah, it's a really good point, right? That if we shift the baseline for all food production towards that transparency, towards that connection, towards naturally produced food, then we have less reliance on, soy production and corn production that feed into, ultra processed foods, but also into meat production, right? If you are shopping with a grass-fed and finished beef farmer, right, that does not use corn and soy to finish their animals, right? Well, then you're helping fix that system kind of throughout the chain. And so you're absolutely right that there's a pound of flesh on both sides of it, right, that need to be considered to say, okay, like moral obligation to care for animals, absolutely, right? What percentage of that is fueled by plant-based food production versus animal production, and then weighing that at an individual level through awareness, through transparency, right?
Yeah, and here's the other thing on that topic, because like you said, pound of flesh on both sides. I love that analogy. That's great. Where people might feel disempowered is the fact that, well, we can't go up against these big corporations with all this power, all this money, all this influence. Like, how am I supposed to make a change with a corrupt food system? But the biggest factor at the end of the day is you. When you go and you spend money on whether it's an animal product or a plant-based product, you are voting and you are showing those higher-ups companies what you're voting for. So as an example, I've said this like 4 times on the podcast. I used to work at a food company, and we really specialized in a lot of processed food. Anyways, when matcha was a trend, when matcha came out, it was super hip, it was super cool. Zach, I kid you not, the amount of matcha products that would fly across our desk, from crackers to cookies to coffees, when they understood that people were voting with their dollars for matcha, they got to capitalize on that. So imagine, let me paint the landscape right now. We're in a very dominated landscape with conventionally raised animals. I would say it's where majority of us get our meat from. When we continue to vote with our dollars, we're perpetuating that system. We're showing the big man, they want more of this, let's keep it going. But imagine if all of us were to shift towards grass-fed, grass-finished, localized farmers with all these transparent requirements and standards. Where would the market shift? These companies are going to adapt. They're not going to continue to sell a product that has no benefit for them. If you're not buying the product, they're not going to make it. They're going to change their processes. Sure, it might be slow, but when we vote with our dollars, that's where the real power comes in.
Yeah. That's a very, very good point. I mean, you vote for the future that you want to live in with every single purchase that you make. My hope would be that as we create that more of that system, more of that access and transparency for people, that not only are we asking the big food companies to like pivot their strategy, because they're always going to pivot their strategy to meet the needs of the consumer. That's where we get like serious issues like greenwashing, right? Big companies, Loblaws knows that you want to see grass-fed and finished or organic. And so our food labeling will just essentially shift to market to the things that you want to see, right? And that's the greenwashing of food labeling, where, it will say grass-finished. Well, newsflash, all beef is technically grass-finished. 99.9% of beef lives on some type of pasture and eats grass at some point in its life before it's moved to a feedlot. What percentage of that, life has been grass-fed, but that's what it says on the label, right? That's what sits on the label. my hope is that as we create access through, technology, like a company like Northern Raised and many others, to bring people you use the word power, to give people the power to say, you don't need to go to Costco. You don't need to go to these large big box stores, right, to get your meat. There are alternatives, right? And we're creating that new market and that new economy that allows us to connect directly to the source of that food. And that's my hope for that we can bring that hyperlocality back into the food system and not just wait for a large food producer to pivot to our consumption habits.
Huge. Yeah, you have the power right now. You can make that choice the second you go to the grocery store, the second you pop online to order something, right?
Yeah.
So Zach, let me give you the stage here, man, because I feel like this is a great transition into what you do with Northern Raised, because it's a remarkable company. Tell listeners what it's all about and how it can benefit them based on our exact conversation today.
That's a great question, man. As I mentioned earlier, right, Northern Raised is a company that connects people with their personal well-being through food. The way that we do that is that we deliver natural, sustainable, ethical, and local meats from Ontario farmers, and we deliver that right to your door, right? So in a nutshell, think of a virtual farmers market, right? And we try to provide the transparency and connection to show you each and every farm that we work with, where that food has come from, and how it gets to your doorstep. The simple way is to jump online and check that out, right? And we hope that that's an easy process, right? But I think in terms of what that provides people from a benefit, my hope is that it brings people on along a similar healing journey that I experienced. That through consciously connecting with their food, they're consciously connecting with themselves, and they're able to step into that better version of themselves through food, right? And through having a connection with what's going into their bodies, right? That's my hope. I believe food is an incredible tool. It's an incredibly powerful vehicle for people to experience, this well-oiled machine that is our physical bodies. I mean, we're walking around driving Ferraris here, right? But most of us have no idea. Most of us are sitting there, a little bit sick, a little bit tired, depleted, not really feeling that they're able to live a fulfilled life. And I believe food is a really powerful tool to assist people in that journey. So that's in a nutshell, that's my hope in terms of what people can access through Northern Raised.
Brother, amazing. We're going to link everything you need to connect with Zach, Northern Raised, in the show notes below. Listeners, check his stuff out. He's great. Amazing mission behind what he does, and madly respect that. And Zach, again, thanks for spending some time with us on the TRE.
Absolutely, man. Really appreciate it.